An election is not won or lost just by how many people voted for one candidate versus how many people voted for other candidates. This aspect of merely counting the votes is important, a necessary condition for sure, but not a sufficient one. Also necessary is a demographic analysis. Which groups voted for whom, and why, and to what extent, and in what order? All of that is also necessary, but still not sufficient, because an election is also won or lost by how many people did not vote. More specifically, how many people of those who should have voted or were reasonably expected to vote in a certain direction and chose not to. A rigorous political operative will want to know as precise as possible how many of those do exist, because oftentimes that group can be decisive, or at the very least a significant influencer. The size of that group is not fixed. It can be increased or shrunk by means of propaganda, specifically by voter suppression propaganda, or in more recent times known as blackpilling. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, although I alluded multiple times to the notion of voter suppression propaganda, I never explained it, so I'd better fix that because it's a procedure that is very easy to implement and can yield great results. It is a very messy tactic, one that I personally try to avoid, or at the very least, if I have to use it, at the very least I try my best to use it truthfully. That is to say, perpetrate voter suppression propaganda using mostly the truth. Still, regardless of my opinion about it, it is a tactic routinely used in elections anywhere on the planet where elections are a thing. It can be useful even in weak or underdeveloped democracies, and it has the advantage of being easy to integrate into a wider party or candidate strategy, as it is not fundamentally incompatible with other tactics. Now, if we want to be very rigorous, voter suppression propaganda is, in a way, a subset of black propaganda. Newer subscribers are strongly advised to watch my January 2018 video called "What is Black Propaganda and How to Use It?" So, as usual, the presentation is divided as follows. 1. What is voter suppression propaganda? 2. The 3 main ways to wield it. 3. Modern-day examples. 4. How to defend and or counteract it. And 5. Conclusions. So, the definition is pretty self-explanatory. Voter suppression propaganda is the type of propaganda meant to persuade people to abstain from voting. Voter suppression propaganda should be understood as separate from voter suppression itself. Voter suppression is the totality of actions, including laws, regulations, policies, intimidations, practices, and so on and so forth, meant to prevent people from voting. Voter suppression propaganda is just the dissemination of information meant to persuade people to abstain from voting. It does not involve any constraint or intimidation. Now, from the definition, it may sound pretty terrible, but wait until I get to the examples and you'll soon realize just how pervasive voter suppression propaganda really is. Anyway, so Chapter 2, the 3 main ways to wield it, to wield voter suppression propaganda. So, the 3 main ways are not related to how it is being dispatched, be it online, in person, or as part of a march or a protest or whatever. It is only related to the narrative approach. So voter suppression propaganda is of 3 types. 1. Doom and gloom or blackpilling. 2. Equivocation. And 3. News. Now, the doom and gloom type is the most well-known to this particular audience, largely because right-wingers are slightly more susceptible to this kind of voter suppression propaganda, though there are versions of it for leftists as well. The format is very easy. Just come up with a story which leads to the conclusion that disaster is inevitable no matter how you vote, so you're better off not voting. As many of you should know, there is nothing inevitable in politics. Claiming otherwise is just wrong, or voter suppression propaganda. I'll show you a very mainstream example later on in the video, just be patient. Equivocation, so voter suppression propaganda by means of equivocation, is a form of voter suppression propaganda which tends to be a bit more successful precisely because it involves the least amount of lying, and it is also very easy to hide under concerned citizen type of messaging, or as I sometimes call it, concerned trolling. Unless you're specifically looking for it, most people never know that they have been subjected to voter suppression propaganda by means of equivocation. As the name says, this format is basically they're all the same type of messaging. I've shown you some of that last year from the Romanian protests, where the most popular chant was all political parties are the same kind of garbage, or toate partidele aceeași mizerie, like this. Now, admittedly, in the United States, sometimes legit campaigning for a certain candidate may be confused with voter suppression propaganda. I mean, in 2020, someone campaigning for Joe Jorgensen or Howie Hawkins could run into the risk of being accused of using voter suppression propaganda by making voters waste their votes. Now, this is a tricky situation. Something similar is routinely done in Europe, where radical groups are seeded into voting marginal parties that rarely, if ever, make the threshold into the parliament. Now, is that necessarily voter suppression propaganda? I would say it isn't, but more like a cynical ploy. It depends on the country, really. In countries with a first-past-the-post system, such an approach is rarely helpful. But in countries with the DONT method of allocation of mandates or seats in the parliament, the so-called wasted votes get redistributed to those who get into the parliament, which can mean quite a lot for the winning party, hence why it is a cynical ploy. For instance, in Poland, it's very helpful to try to convince as many communists as possible to vote for the smaller communist parties, because those are very unlikely to make the threshold, and thus their votes are more likely to be favorably redistributed to the ruling right-wing Prawo i Sprawiedliwość. Anyway, examples aside, voter suppression propaganda by means of equivocation is a very corrosive way of doing politics. My own country is a very prime example of that. Almost all political parties used this method from 2004 onwards, and the result is a lower and lower turnout to the polls. Now, that may not sound like a bad thing, and it isn't if it's rare, but decades of low turnout is a recipe for disaster. Admittedly, the effects vary depending on the election format. For instance, during the Brexit campaigns, there was a version of this. If you remember the talking point, the Lib-Lab-Con coalition, which was meant to suggest that all of the three mainstream parties of Britain are essentially pro-EU. However, that talking point subsided when Brexit passed. That is to say, those who created the talking point were trying to be truthful, and when that was no longer true, that is to say, the mainstream parties were no longer ostensibly pro-EU, the talking point was renounced, was parked, was revoked. But there are countries where this kind of talk is used continuously, and that is corrosive. So be careful with this. Over-reliance on this can have unpredictable results, and not of the kind ones of unpredictable. Finally, the third type, via news. This one is very easy and self-explanatory. You find out a piece of news that is embarrassing for a candidate, and then you disseminate that piece of news among the electorate of that candidate or of that political party. Like, Hillary's emails, for instance. Or the piece of news that Jeremy Corbyn may be an anti-Semite, if you recall, from December 2019. All political parties and all candidates have things that are embarrassing for them. The key is to find a way to package that information in such a way that depresses the voters of that candidate in order to be successful in suppressing the vote via propaganda. It doesn't always work, and in some cases it may have the opposite effect. I mean, remember grab them by the pussy? That was supposed to be voter suppression propaganda. It had the opposite effect. The key here is to select the piece of news as close as possible to the values of the electorate of that candidate. So, for instance, if you wanted to convince likely Republican voters to stay at home and abstain from voting, you'd have to find something embarrassing that those voters find important and not something that the opposition finds embarrassing. I mean, Trump having said grab them by the pussy may have been embarrassing in feminist Democrat circles, but as it turned out, it wasn't anywhere else. So, while it is the easiest to implement, voter suppression propaganda by means of news requires a lot of study. The political operative engaging in this tactic has to know quite a lot about the targeted group. Alright, so chapter 3, modern day examples. Well, I already gave a few examples, so maybe I should call this further examples. Anyway, here's my favorite example of voter suppression propaganda from 1996.
So I have solved this little political dilemma for myself in a very simple way. On election day, I stay home. I don't vote. Fuck them. Fuck them. I don't vote. Two reasons I don't vote. First of all, it's meaningless. This country was bought and sold and paid for a long time ago. The shit they shuffle around every 4 years doesn't mean a fucking thing. So I know that a little later on this year, you're going to have another one of those really swell presidential elections that you like so much. You'll enjoy yourselves. It'll be a lot of fun. I'm sure as soon as the election is over, your country will improve immediately. As for me, I'll be home on that day doing essentially the same thing as you. The only difference is, when I get finished masturbating, I'm going to have a little something to show for it, folks.
Pure coincidence that 1996 was an election year and Bill Clinton wasn't exactly doing well. George Carlin, of course, had a strong following on the right as well, despite him being largely a leftist. Of course, George Carlin wasn't the only one to do this in 96. There were many others, and that's how Bill Clinton won re-election, by convincing enough non-leftists that there is nothing that can be done. Well, Ross Perot's candidacy and Bob Dole being kinda weak also helped, but that's a story for another day. This example is also good because nobody knows whether George Carlin was doing it intentionally or not. What we do know is that this aspect did not make it back into Carlin's routine for another 10 years. Only in 2006 a similar kind of commentary made it into Carlin's routine. Nobody ever asked him specifically on whether this was intentional. It is safe to say, though, that George Carlin held the American society in great contempt.
Yeah, the public sucks. There's a nice campaign slogan for somebody. The public sucks. Fuck hope. Fuck hope.
And this is a feature when distributing voter suppression propaganda. Such propaganda can, and indeed should, use pre-existent figures, groups, leaders, and institutions. That's why any political operative maintains connections with as many figures like these as possible in case a certain political project emerges, and that project needs this kind of messaging. Now, I mentioned earlier the Lib-Lab-Con coalition, which is a voter suppression propaganda term for the United Kingdom. Well, there is a similar one in the United States as well, the Republicrats. It's not a new term, it dates back to the 1870s, but it's still being used. Now, admittedly, the term Republicrat is not always used as a voter suppression tool. Sometimes it's used to signal third partyism, or when used by voters to refer to themselves to signal some sort of an independent voter. Whatever. While the reason and the public rationale for the use of terms like Republicrat has changed over the last 150 years, the result is always the same: to induce to voters the idea that they're better off not voting, or if they do vote, they'd better vote third party because they're all the same, man. There are always a few million US voters who buy into this. Sometimes that's not enough to change the outcome, but sometimes it is. And then there is the almost identical type of voter suppression propaganda, identical, that is to say, it doesn't matter in which country you're using it, namely to overstate the incumbent. This is a bulk example. So compare the propaganda for CDU in Germany in 2017, the propaganda for Fidesz in 2018, the one for Morawiecki in Poland in 2019, or really any suppression propaganda for the incumbent in the last decade. They all rely on overstating the abilities. In 2017, we all heard how Merkel can change the weather. Well, not really. But The Guardian legit told everyone that she can unilaterally change the language itself. The subtext there being that there is no point in campaigning for the opposition or trying to challenge her. In 2018, Fidesz operatives tried their best to demoralize leftist challengers by overselling Orbán Viktor's constituency abroad. Many of you might not know, but the Hungarian government at some point gave citizenship to millions of people of somewhat distant Hungarian ethnicity in the neighboring countries. Yes, those people formed a largely pro-Fidesz constituency, but not to the extent that it would make Fidesz impossible to beat. Yet that narrative worked. So yeah, that's basically how you do it. Just right now you can see a lot of Democrat operatives and plenty of useful idiots on the right, I might add, spreading stories and narratives about how the 2022 elections cannot be won because of election fraud. Of course, fraud exists and it's as American as diabetes, but not even trying guarantees a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's the point of voter suppression propaganda. Alright, chapter 4, how to defend against it and how to counteract it. Well, the short answer is this: scream louder and watch the trends. By watch the trends, I mean know who is being affected. For instance, during the 2020 parliamentary elections campaign in Romania, we deployed quite a bit of voter suppression propaganda, but only after we analyzed who is being affected by the already existent one. As mentioned earlier, the messaging to the tune of all parties are the same is quite endemic in this country, but that message could be twisted. What if all parties can only mean the parties currently in the parliament? This kind of twist was successfully used both in 2016 and 2020 by left-wing USR and right-wing Alliance for the Unification of Romanians, respectively. Both events saw record-low turnouts, which meant more value for every vote cast for the new political forces. Usually, when defending against or counteracting voter suppression propaganda, the operative needs to be very certain about what he or she wants, and there is no room for idealism when making that decision. For instance, if you're outnumbered and outspent, it is futile to attempt to stop or counteract voter suppression propaganda, so your best bet is to subvert it and use it to your advantage, like we did in Romania last year, and like it should be done in Germany this year. I'm just saying. The hardest type of voter suppression propaganda, the hardest type to defend against it, I mean, is the one made by means of news. And that is because you can't control the flow of news. Well, you can, just not effectively. This is the reason why I keep on saying that one of the first things you do when you take over a campaign is to press the candidate to be fully transparent with you, the propagandist. When you manage a campaign, make sure you know all there is to know. Everything, from an innocent flirt 20 years ago to some shady deal 10 years ago that seems highly unlikely to be unearthed, everything has to be on the table. Why? Because you need counter-narratives for every single one of them, including for cases of voter suppression propaganda. Nevertheless, the voter suppression propaganda by means of news is the hardest precisely because there are always surprises and you can't plan for every scenario, which is why spontaneity and ingenuity are highly valuable skills in this business. A political operative who can't come up with new approaches on the fly is one that is unlikely to be successful on the long run. The simplest to counteract is the one by means of doom and gloom, or blackpilling, or demoralization, call it whatever you want. The problem here is that one needs infrastructure, so in other words, it's simple but not easy. In other words, the tactic to counteract voter suppression propaganda by means of doom and gloom is quite simple. Just pump in positive messaging, debunk falsehoods, and lead by a positive example. Not hard at all. But one has to do that consistently, and that requires infrastructure, and resilience, and time, which means money, and that's the challenge. And it's a challenge particularly for small political parties, because small parties already have troubles with funding, and it is rarely the case that they invest in keeping their voter base energized. Well, they should. One of the changes that I personally always bring when I work with a political group is to create a permanent office tasked specifically to keep the voter base energized. Why? Precisely as a bulwark against voter suppression propaganda by means of doom and gloom. Somewhere between these two is the difficulty of defending against the variant of equivocation, and that is because oftentimes voter suppression propaganda by means of equivocation is, well, true, or mostly true, which means it spreads like wildfire even without much coordination, which is kind of terrible. The way I've had personally most success in counteracting it was by limiting the equivocation, in the form of, yes, they're somewhat the same, but not all, and not exactly the same, and insert preferred candidate or party here is different because insert strongest feature of the preferred candidate here. I realize this sounds terrible, but it works. And it works because in political propaganda one can apply roughly the same rules as in economics and business. And in business it's been over 20 years now since the proverb differentiate or die has become mainstream knowledge. And emphasizing difference is quite an efficient tactic to defend against voter suppression propaganda by means of equivocation. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but then again, voter suppression propaganda in itself is not perfect either. Well, in fact, no method is perfect, which is why there are so many tools in this business of politics. They're all in conjunction with each other. Those who seek silver bullets, well, more often than not, they end up losing. All right. Finally, Chapter 5, Conclusions. Well, there are basically three conclusions. 1. Voter suppression propaganda is real whether you like it or not. Buying into it is optional though. So every time you're being spoon-fed stories about how they're all the same, learn to recognize that is voter suppression propaganda. 2. You don't need to be a think tank expert or educated in the highest levels of academia to engage in voter suppression propaganda. The very existence of this type of messaging has only been openly acknowledged a few years ago, even though it has been around for more than 150 years. The only reason it is being discussed in the first place is because finally the right has learned how to use it. You see, it's terrible when Republicans used targeted messaging to tell black people that Kamala Harris sent multiple innocents to jail. But somehow it wasn't terrible when George Carlin was urging right-wingers not to vote. Conclusion number 3. Voter suppression propaganda or defense against it cannot be the only tool used in a campaign. Just ask Hillary Clinton about that if you don't believe me. So yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, consider giving a shekel if you like what we do, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.